Okay, let's dive into tonight's presentation. So as I mentioned to start with, this is really a good follow-up to last week's presentation on camera settings simplified. And I think that's so foundational because in our own creative process and journey as artists and photographers, we're faced with a really unique challenge of this combination of technical challenges and skill set that we have to develop around the use of our gear and cameras. And then also to really push our creative boundaries. And they really require very different capacities. And yet we have to bring those and marry those as one sort of coherent experience when we're in the field photographing. So consider last week as really the foundation. Really, if you feel like that's still a challenge for you, getting your camera off of auto and starting to really work with those 5 fundamental settings, continue to explore that and really work with that in low stakes situations where you can really start to develop confidence, because confidence is really key to creativity, especially with photography. If we start to feel confident about our technical execution, some really obvious shifts start to happen within our mind and our bodies and our heart to be able to see, sense, and feel into the moment in a very different way when we have that sort of background creative confidence to work with, that what we experience in the field can accurately translate through the technical execution with our camera. So this week is more about how do we actually continue to free ourselves and creatively so that when we're in the field in sort of really great fleeting situations, that we're not burdensome with our gear or camera settings, or many other things that I'll bring light to tonight that you'll see can really disrupt or create barriers to the creative opening that we're trying to access. So I'm going to say a little bit more about the whole creative process, and that's going to be the primary share of what I want to offer you tonight. So slides aren't working. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the path of the artist. Really, this path is about going from our current way of seeing and being to a new way of seeing and being. And how do we actually make that transition as artists, as photographers? That there's, if you've been photographing for more than 2 or 3 years, you'll already be able to start to see that your work, your creative expression, your eye starts to evolve. And this is it's a journey, it's an evolutionary journey as artists, as visual artists and creative artists, that we can start to notice how our craft evolves, how we're able to see differently, how we're able to execute our creative intent differently. That evolves over time. Come on. Sticky slides. Give me a moment. Okay. So why do we see the way we see? The world of humanity. What we start to recognize with the world of humanity is that the way we construct the world, it's based on patterns, pragmatism, which is practical use, uniformity, and intentional design, so that most of what we encounter in the human constructed world has these kinds of qualities to them, that lines are a very particular way, that there's repetitious patterns and uniformity. What this does is start to condition our minds and our eyes to a very particular and oftentimes limited way of seeing reality or relating to reality, which is why in like this photo from Italy with the door and the window, I mean, the architecture is beautiful. don't get me wrong, but what really jumps out as being very unique and different is the plant life, the flowers, because they don't have linear lines to them. They don't have a particular shape for a particular function, a human intended function. So they stand out in this composition. And we start to see repetitive patterns everywhere, which really does start to condition how we see reality. In the human constructed world, both temporal and spatial, which means time and space, forms are pragmatically and purposefully designed. You can see a few examples here. This bottom right photo, I believe this is the New York Marathon or a big city marathon. We can start to see that how we construct the world from a human perspective is that the space and the objects within the space are designed with a specific intention. And now all of a sudden, space takes on a very linear construction. A marathon's a great example. You can see big city marathons winding their way through city streets for a very specific intent and design of a 26-mile race. What we'll notice in nature, nature doesn't work like this. And I'll get into this in great detail in a few more slides. But we can start to see that every shape that we encounter in the human constructed world is designed for a specific purpose and intent. And it has a very linear, uniform shape to it. Most of human design is sequential and linear, purposefully and structurally compartmentalized around specific purpose and intent of use. Again, this causes us to see and think that the material reality is solid, lasting, and independent, that there isn't an interdependence or a network connection to all the objects. A house is different than a car. A car is different than a roadway. A roadway is different than a satellite dish. Every single form and function in the human constructed world is designed around a specific intent, and that a specific intent of time and space. And we're so conditioned to this. So this is part of the creative challenge as nature photographers, because we don't encounter any of this in the wild lands of nature, in the natural world. We don't encounter the same relationship to time and space. So part of it is learning to recognize how we've sort of habitually see the world around us through this constructed reality of time and space, and start to learn to relax that so we can come into a different relationship to time and space. What I call a lot of the sort of human constructed world is conceptual and conditioned creativity, because it has these sort of very common patterns to them. Every object has a unique form and function. They can still be beautiful. This is not about throwing out the human constructed world and just going into nature. It's recognizing the challenge that presents for us as nature photographers, that even in the beauty of urban development that is really made beautiful, like a lot of these scenes in Italy, I find them really striking and beautiful. But every single object is designed with a specific intent. Every form and function in the human world is objectifiably independent from every other object. Like this water well is different than the doorway, is different than the alleyway, is different than the windows. Every single form, function is designed with a specific intent of use. It's just really valuable to notice this and how conditioned our mind and eye is to seeing reality like this. Yeah, all this conditions us to compartmentalize our thoughts, our feelings, and behaviors into unique and isolated experiences. That we are different than the world out there. We're different than a car. We're different than a house. We're different from this water well or a brick wall. So it creates this sense of separation and isolation. And I think a really huge part of or value of what we can come into in the creative process with nature photography is start to soften that apparent boundary of or separation from self to what's out there. That we start to learn to soften or suspend that perception of separation or isolation. And I'll talk more about that in a few more slides. Where it becomes problematic is when we start to objectify and compartmentalize the natural world. The conceptual mind wants to compartmentalize and the unified whole of nature into separate, isolated parts. Part of that is great. It's fantastic knowledge. I love going into the field with my friends that are really good with geology because they can actually tell me what I'm looking at. And I mean, I've learned some geology now hanging out with these friends, but it's fascinating. So that's part of it. And, it's like understanding the sedimental layers of the Grand Canyon, like in this lower photo, or these Badlands in Utah in the upper photo, is really fascinating. But these are conceptual labels that we place on the reality of nature as human beings. It's great knowledge, and it can also be disruptive to the creative process, as you'll see. Once we conceptually label something as different and independent, the felt sense of wholeness can be compromised. And that's a big part of what I teach in my own photo workshops and in field practices, is how to come into wholeness or a unified connection with nature, so that the conceptual framework of how we see and think of nature actually start to soften, and we can start to feel more connected to the natural world. And that can really strongly inform our creative process and a new way of seeing and being with our art in really profound ways. So this is part of the process. It's a practice. We all have lived, if we've been on the planet more than 20 years, we're very conditioned to seeing and thinking and feeling of reality and the relationship to time and space in pretty compartmentalized linear ways. So to actually learn to see and connect to the natural world in new ways takes practice. And I'll outline some of these practices in tonight's presentation. It's sort of paradoxical. I call it the whole part paradox of nature. That what we notice in nature are there's no straight lines in nature. They may seem straight, but they're not. There's no uniformity in nature. No two trees are the same. You can go into Colorado backcountry and look at the aspens, and all of them are beautiful, but every single one is slightly unique. So there is no uniformity. There is no linear construction to how nature shows up. Every part is an expressed whole. Let's use this bottom left photo of the river weaving its way through the valley. Just depends on how you want to frame it. Does the river define the landscape, or does the landscape define and contain the river? It's sort of paradoxical. It's both. And so now the river and the land are not separate. It's part of an interdependent network of connection. We can see that in the upper photo too, of a river weaving its way through a sandbank. Does the sand define the path of the river, or does the river define the contours and the textures of the sand? We can get into this conceptually, and we get into this paradox. but we can start to recognize that they're not separate. Like a car is different than a house, the river and the sandbank, or the river in the bottom left and the valley and the earth around it are not separate. Much like the sediment of the Badlands in the lower right photo, you can't, well, for one, you can't remove a layer of sediment without the entire whole disintegrating. And every single band of sediment you see there informs the one below and above. It gives it shape and informs its qualities of color, of texture, of shape. You can't remove one part from the whole in nature. Really good examples of this, and probably most of you have heard of this, is research that they've been doing in Yellowstone over the last several years. They couldn't figure out why the plant life was really starting to vanish. And what they ended up discovering is with the reintroduction of the wolves, it started to balance the entire ecosystem because there was so many grazers that were eating all the plant life before the trees and the plants could grow to um, a healthy level, that they were just getting eaten by all the grazers. You introduce the wolves, or you reintroduce the wolves, which are native there, and it balances the whole ecosystem. That's a good example of how the interconnectivity and the network wholeness of nature works. This can be really informative with our own creative process, as you'll see. So what is the visionary gap and how do we access it? So let me define first what I mean by the visionary gap. When we're sort of in the conceptual mind of just how we relate to time and space and our reality, the human constructed world around us, there's not a lot of gaps. This is a similar gap to what a lot of the great meditation traditions refer to as emptiness or stillness. I'm just calling it the visionary gap because when we start to learn to access that as artists, it's not just empty. We can start to have really creative information show up in that space. So it's the vast, unbounded space between thoughts, between feelings, between ideas, between concepts, so that we learn to, through practice, breath practice, presencing practices, start to quiet the mind, that the conceptual mind starts to quiet. The reactivity of our nervous system and our emotions in our body starts to quiet, so that we can actually receive something unique and novel in the moment instead of this constant stream of conceptual and conditioned thought. This is a hugely important aspect of the creative process. You can also think of this as the creative flow state, where something shifts mentally, emotionally, physically in our nervous system, that we start to access a much more spacious reality. And we start to get into a flow state with our creative process. Athletes use this all the time, extreme athletes especially. They know how to invoke creative flow states. I think this is equally valuable for artists to be able to learn how to invoke a creative flow state and a spacious mindset and emotional openness where something new can show up and start to inform our creative intent. So that's what I would call the visionary gap. How do we access it? I think, let me say this, I think it's every single one of us has accessed this many times. We and some of us will recognize that as, oh my God, yes, that's the state. That's what I strive for every time I'm in the field. And and some of us when I point it out, you'll go, oh yeah, I actually have. But we sort of forget because the constant stream of thought fills the space between thoughts, fills the space between emotions or a felt sense. It's the content of our mind fills the space, so we no longer notice the space. But think about some of your most extraordinary experiences in nature, some of your most spectacular moments or sunrises or sunsets or wildlife encounters, things that caught you by surprise, aha moments, where maybe it was the first time you went to a particular amazing location like the Grand Canyon, or um, maybe a huge falls like Victoria Falls or something like that. And your experience was one of just absolute awe, speechlessness. It's when moments of nature leave us speechless, it's a momentary suspension of thought. And it's a very still quietude. And it can feel very open and spacious and unbounded. And then, usually, very quickly, thoughts come in. We start to conceptually analyze our experience, what we're looking at. Oh, wow, that's a huge waterfall. How high is it? Wow, this canyon is so big. How far across or how deep is it? The conceptual mind starts up very quick, and we start to sort of apply our constructed creative ideologies onto the experience. But the moment we first encountered it, none of that was present. We were just left speechless, just in awe. That's the creative gap. And we can reliably, as artists, use that, access that, and leverage that for our creative process and our creative expression. That's a big part of what I teach in the Vision Quest creativity retreats, is how do we actually access that gap so that we can intentionally cultivate that when we go out into the field, we know what to do to create that state shift mentally, emotionally, physically, so that we become more open and receptive to something novel in the moment, to more of what nature is just showing us in the moment, free of our concepts. Stillness and silence are usually required of this. I mean, this is all the great meditation traditions teach us this, that when we're in constant thought, it's very hard to notice the vast spaciousness. And so we have to practice that. We sit in meditation, we work with our breathing practices. We can bring these same practices into the field. I've been meditating for 25 years and use this as a daily practice and a really integral practice as far as my photographic and creative process goes. Here's some qualities of the difference when we're in conceptual mind, sort of the conditioned conceptual mind, that the conceptual mind sees objects in space. Like we can use this slide, the top slide. Our conceptual mind is going to see the objects in space. In this case, it's the trees. And we're going to label, these are aspen trees. These are, fall color leaves. That we know, we have certainty of what this is, what reality is actually presenting to us. The awakened mind, or more the meditative mind or the receptive mind, feels into the space between objects. So just for a moment, I want you to look at this photo at the top and look at the trees, just all the trees. There's hundreds and hundreds of trees in this one composition. There's only about a dozen that really stand out, but there's hundreds in this composition. Focus on the trees, focus on the yellow leaves. And then start to shift your attention to the space between the trees. Look for all the space between the trees. And you'll start to notice, wow, there's a lot of space in this photo. And it felt like that at the time of capture. And that really strongly informed the composition of how many objects do I want to have revealed in the space. The space was primary, the objects were secondary. And it creates a much more spacious felt sense and connection to the scene and to the moment. The awakened mind sees the vast expanse as the great unifier or integrator. Shift your awareness down to the photo below. Same thing. Look at the objects in the space and quickly notice, oh yeah, the mind is going to be, oh, that's a reticulated giraffe. Those are pink flamingos. That's a lake and a shoreline of grass. We got all the objects. We know what's going on. That helps us orient. But now shift your awareness and your attention to the space between the objects. And you might notice that there's a shift mentally or maybe even emotionally that starts to feel freer, more, it creates a sense of curiosity of now the objects actually become more apparent in a strange way. This is part of the paradox, is that when we focus and connect on the space between the objects, we can start to understand that there's an intelligence of how the objects relate to one another. This isn't, we're looking at these aspen trees, or we're looking at these birds and the giraffe. There's nothing random about this. It's really intelligent design. There's a highly organized intelligence that informs what objects and how the objects show up in the space. Those birds are positioning themselves exactly where they need to, and in a way that we can't understand if we're just labeling them. But we can start to come into a different relationship with objects once we make this shift. It's what I also call holographic wholeness or holographic seeing, is that every part is a reflection of the unbroken wholeness. We can see that in this photo. It looks like there's uniformity, but there isn't. There is repetitious pattern, but the pattern is not uniform, and every single pattern that we see informs the whole. It influences every other part in the whole. We start to see this wholeness externally, and we start to feel it internally when we can make this shift from the conceptual mind of analyzing and labeling everything to a more spacious form of mind and emotion, an emotional quality that feels open and receptive. We start to see, sense, and feel as one unified experience. So much of what I think one of the obstacles I see with photography is that it's very visual. It has a very strong visual centricity to it, which means it's visually dominant. And that's a huge part of the point of photography. That's the point of it, right? But it doesn't have to be all there is. Yes, we're looking at the world out there. In our case, most of us probably on this webinar have this love and passion for nature photography. So we're pointing our camera at the world out there. And we are taking a visual representation or a visual impression of the scene. But merely what we see doesn't have to be the only thing that informs our creative expression. We can start to come into relationship with the moment, with nature, in a way that enlivens all of our senses. so that all five senses and our subtle senses of intuition and instinct and visionary seeing can also start to inform the creative process and ultimately how we see the world and what we choose to take a photo of. So it's a full spectrum attunement that, yes, what we see is important. That's the point of photography, or one of the primary points of photography. But you also notice, and you may have experienced it with some of my photos, is that it leaves an impression on how you feel. It shifts how you feel as well. It's not just a visual, literal representation of the moment. Powerful photography changes how we feel. And it can change, they can be so powerful, it can shift how we come into relationship with the natural world. I think an example I've used time and again, because I'm still astonished at just how potent this is. If you take Ansel Adams' 60 greatest images and you add up the exposure time that the shutter was actually open to capture those 60 images, it might be a few minutes, maybe. So in a few minutes, he changed an entire cultural perception of the natural world, way beyond just what we see. This is a huge part of what drove conservation movements and designating national parks and protected wildlands, because, and he's not the only one instrumental in this, and we can each have our own part in this. But when we start to think about powerful image making, how it can actually shift an entire culture, shift our mindset, shift our values, it's really powerful. This medium is extremely powerful. So the more that we can access these unique creative states, then something unique can show up for each and every one of us. And then we have an important part in the story to share through our image making. What we also start to notice with this holographic wholeness is our direct felt experience and our creative intent starts to feel coherent. Part of what I was trying to stress last week is that we have the technical execution of what we're doing in the field, and we have our creative intent of what we're doing in the field, and how fully does that translate into image making that really reflects the coherence of our experience. So too, that when we're out in nature, are we feeling completely separate from what we're photographing? If so, there's a bridge that can be made that helps what we're seeing, sensing, and feeling come alive in our direct experience and feel coherent with our image making. So that in the final image, there's coherence in what I was seeing, sensing, and feeling, and how I felt connected to the moment and to the natural world. That there's coherence and continuity through the whole experience, from capture to final presentation. And that's a really very different way of experiencing ourselves and our creative work. So what are some practices that we can work with, practical ways that we can work with that help us access these sort of foundational practices in the field for cultivating the visionary gap or awakened mind, or whatever, or creative flow state, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to pigeonhole it because it's really so immense and vast and rich with potential. I don't want to label it in a way that it's just compartmentalized. So whatever that is for you and how you relate to what I'm talking about, visionary gap doesn't work, throw it out. Use what works for you. But you'll notice it in your own experience. Go back to your own experiences in nature and start to notice, oh yeah, when I experienced that encounter with the bear, or encountered this amazing field of wildflowers, something shifted. Maybe it was a spectacular sunset where something just profoundly shifted for you. That's what I'm talking about. Better yet, don't label it. Just recognize that it's different than our sort of everyday consciousness. And that's what we're trying to access and leverage for our creative process. So I've identified sort of 5 ways in my own practice through teaching through years and my own sort of field practices of what I work with when I go out into the field. And we'll go through these one at a time. So I'll just sort of highlight them now and then we'll go into them a little bit more detail. 1, creative visualization, the imaginal realm. We have to allow ourselves to fantasize, to be creative, to imagine. We all do this every day through dream process or through our dream experiences. And we can do that through waking experiences as well. So once we find a subject or a location, whether it's landscape or wildlife or macro or drone photography or whatever sort of captures your interest, time lapse, we start to come into connection with that sort of medium and that subject matter that allows ourselves to be creative, to get into the visionary realm, the imaginal realm. 2, planning and prep and gear management. What has that got to do with creativity? I'll get into that. It's super, super important, really important. This is probably one of the biggest ones that takes us out of the creative flow state. 3, contact and connection with the light and life of the land. We can also, an additional part of this is scouting, but I don't want it to be like the whole thing is about scouting. It's not, and I'll expand on that. Stillness and presence practices. How do we actually learn to become more present in nature? And how do we learn to quiet our minds and our emotions so that we can be more connected to the moment exactly as it is, not how we impose our concepts on the moment. And then last, how do we alter time and space with creative intent? Because once, to back up to 4, once we start to learn to become still and present and quiet our thoughts and emotions, we have a different relationship to time and space. And you'll see this in some of the images that I'll use as a demonstration, that it's a very different relationship to time and space, and that's part of the story that I'm wanting to tell. So let's go into these a little bit more detail one at a time. Creative visualizations, the imaginal realm. So each one of these images represents a vision that I had before I actually captured the image. These were things that I imagined, and some of them were really close, like this bottom right one of False Kiva in Canyonlands. That took me 2 years of imagining and 3 different trips to bring that imaginal realm into a final image. And I captured this probably 14 years ago. It's been done many times since, and I think I was probably the first one to do this, but it was very unique in its time. And I imagined I visited there once, and I felt this sense of presence by maybe ancient indigenous people that had been there before and maybe had done ceremony. But I just sat in this kiva for probably 2 hours and meditated, and I started to really get a connection to the place and started to feel this sort of unbounded timeline of all the people that had been there and how they could have possibly used this space. So I wanted to create a felt sense of that. So it was actually a difficult shot to get. What I did was put my Coleman lantern in the kiva. It looks like a fire, hopefully. I've been told many times it looks like a fire. No, I didn't put a live fire in the kiva. It was just my Coleman lantern. And then I used 10 strobes to illuminate with warming gels to illuminate the alcove. But it's a single shot. So we have 3 light sources there, the 10 strobes, the Coleman lantern, and the moon illuminating the canyon beyond. And I imagined that way before I took it. I imagined it, figured out how I would technically execute that, and then it took 3 trips of messing it up before I got it right. But that's an example of, now that's very technical execution. It was a lot of strategy to execute that. These other 2 were more, I use Google Earth as a very good scouting tool often, and it can give me a sense of the lay of the land, and it allows me to start to imagine how I could photograph it without actually having a photograph. These 2 photographs of not, you won't find other compositions by other photographers of these. These are very unique. And I imagined them just by using visualization, using imagery I found from Google Earth, and imagined these compositions before I went into the field and captured them. So this is how we use the creative imaginal realm. We can do it with any subject matter. I've used it with wildlife. I've used it with waterfalls and clouds and canyons. You can use it with anything, any subject matter that you are fascinated with and connected to. You can start to actually call in creative compositions and visualizations that can really help to inform how you execute the photo in the field. So that's the first one, creative visualizations in the imaginal realm. Very useful tool. Planning, prep, and gear management. This is probably the #1 problem that I've seen in the field with students, is how to manage their gear. There's sort of 2 ways of thinking about that. There's the technical execution, like the camera settings and all the buttons and dials, and how to use your tripod and filters and things like that. That's one aspect of it. And then there's the organization of our gear. Super important. I'm really meticulous with my gear in the organization of it, because, and I've made all these mistakes over the years, and I'm just refining the systems I use to be tighter and tighter, so that when I'm going through the imaginary realm of how am I going to photograph this scene, am I going to need filters? Am I going to need time release cables? Am I going to need motion control devices if I'm doing a time lapse? So once I go through the stage 1 of visualizing and sort of pre-visualizing and imagining the kind of shots that I want to achieve in the field, then I start to pack and organize my gear in a way that it's all completely available, so that I'm not fishing through my bag like I have for years prior to this system. Where did I put that filter? Where was my time release cable? Oh, my tripod head, the screw is wobbly. Now I can't do long exposures. I forgot to charge my batteries. I forgot to clear my cards. All of you guys would probably, oh yeah, I've done that. Oh yeah, I've done that. We've all done those mistakes. And every single time we encounter that in the field, it disrupts or stops the creative flow. The more organized we can be with our gear, the more efficient and simplified we can be with the interface with our gear, the more we can stay focused on the subject, the more we can be connected to the moment, so that I know exactly where my 10 stop filter is. I know exactly where my spare batteries are. I know exactly where everything in my bag is. And I pack my bags specifically for the kind of things I'm going to encounter in nature. And then I also prepare for what I I don't know that I'm going to encounter. So it's this paradox of like, I want to be prepared for things that I imagine I'm going to photograph, but keep that, I suspend that. And then I keep a large part of my attention and awareness on things that just want to emerge, that are going to be surprising. And I make sure that I'm prepared as well as I can for both. Gear organization, planning, and prep are really important for this. I've seen so many photographers get frustrated and um, really discouraged in the field because they don't have the gear for what they're encountering in the moment, or they left it in the vehicle, or their cart is full and they don't have a new one. They forgot to clear it. Just endless frustrations. And I've committed them all. So this is where I'm um, really focused on keeping my systems tight and organized so that I can be in the creative flow in the moment. Okay, what's next? Contact and connection with light and land. These are two good examples, and also part of what scouting is. So these are images from Le Trime, um, what is it called? Trecime National Park in Italy. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Uh, the first image, top left, this is daytime scouting. I spent hours just hiking around the mountains. I had my camera, no tripod. I had water in my camera. That's it. And that's typically what I take for scouting. And I'll just go out and I'll shoot a little bit. I'll find places to sit down. I'll find places to lay down and just look up at the sky and the clouds moving. I really tried to establish a connection with the land, a felt sense of what this place is. And I'd not been there before. And I started to really spend quality time not checking my phone or listening to podcasts or in distracting conversations. Oftentimes I just go out into the field by myself, quiet, intentionally doing short meditations, breathing practices, touching the earth. Contact with the earth is really important. Um, I think what we can get into from the sort of conceptual mind is the objectification of nature, where we have no contact with nature. We have these thick-soled shoes and we're sort of buffered from the environment and the elements. And as a photographer, ask yourself, how much contact do you actually have with the natural world? Do you touch the tree bark, the rocks, the earth? Do you pick up the earth? Do you feel that? This is an important way of making contact and connection with what we're photographing. And it's that full sensory attunement. Stop, listen, watch, touch, feel what's happening. Even if you can, like up in the Arctic where I'll be leading tours next year, there's so many berries on the tundra. It's like, taste it, touch it, feel it. Really immerse yourself in the experience and allow a full sensory experience to inform your creative process, not just what we're seeing objectively, something that's out there. So scouting throughout that day, I found I love those mountain peaks, and the light is very harsh there. It's very flat and sort of lifeless as far as the color goes, but it allowed me to make contact with the earth, connection to the environment, and started to clarify my creative intent so that later in the evening at dusk, I knew what I wanted to do. There was clouds all day that were just going super close, drifting right over the mountaintops, and oftentimes the mountaintops were obscured with cloud. So I knew what I wanted to communicate. I wanted to show the sense of the cloud, of the mountain peaks being immersed in the clouds, and the clouds sort of drifting over the mountain peaks. I knew I needed a long exposure for that. First exposure was 1/250th of a second. The second one was 6 minutes. That allowed me to create or execute my creative intent. But it was the contact, connection, the time, the breathing, the meditation, really seeing, sensing, and feeling from a full sensory experience that allowed me to capture that final image. Very important. Number 4, the stillness and presence practices. What I say to students in my workshops is don't take a photo, receive the moment, and let it inform your creative intent. I think with photographers, there's this ambition that can arise where we just want to make it happen. We go out there and make it happen, and we're capturing or extracting imagery from nature. There's a sense of sort of taking. And what I like to invite people into is the feeling of receiving, that you can receive the moment. And any of you that have sort of practiced some of these ways of being in nature will know that all it takes is for us to sit in nature for about 20 minutes and things happen. Animals start to relax, birds start to relax. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes, especially for wildlife, to actually start to relax into their normal behavior, because oftentimes human presence is very disruptive. And what we start to see, if you're looking at a canyon or a forest, and we're looking through our sort of conditioned conceptual mind, we don't see much happening. When we can stop, be still, quiet, we start to notice movement all over the place. Not just big movement like animals. We start to notice subtleties of wind, of insects moving, of birds, of so many things that are just moving in the environment. And the more sort of myopic we can get, like we start, this is the beauty of macro photography, we start to focus in on just a tiny little patch of earth for 20 minutes. We see all sorts of movement and life happening. So it really gives us a very different perception of the interconnectivity of the natural world. And we start to feel more connected to the wholeness when we start to practice these kinds of things in nature, instead of constantly going after it to get the shot. Receive the shot, pause, relax, receive it. Nature gives us so much. We just have to be available to receiving. And that's a big part of what this practice is and what I teach in the photo workshops. So just times of contemplation, you know, this top photo is of me practicing yoga at one of my favorite places in Marble Canyon. And most of the day I'm not photographing. I just walking the rim of really connecting with the land. And this is a way that really helps me to get very clear. All thoughts have to vanish when I'm doing yoga on this platform. Sitting in nature by a waterfall, just taking it in. Really, really powerful. Okay, the last one. So with these presencing and stillness practices, we come into a different relationship with time and space. They both, time tends to slow and space tends to open up, so that fixed relationships to objects like this sneezeweed plant. Sneezeweed plants are not very big. They're maybe, this one was about 6 inches. It was at 13,000 feet. So it was stunted, but it was beautiful. I wanted that to be much more prominent in this landscape of the mountains. So I used a very wide angle lens and got super close to it, so it became very prominent. And this is how, what I find so fascinating about photography is how through the use of optics, we can distort or alter time and space to tell a different story and create a different felt sense of the moment. That's an example of how we can alter space, that relatively speaking, this tiny little flower shouldn't be as big in relationship to those mountains, but through the use of optics and wide angle optics, we can tell that story and we can create that feeling and bring more prominence to small objects like that. The wildebeest in the top left. This is, I played with this kind of shot for probably 2 or 3 days. It's a long lens shot with my 200 to 400, very slow shutter speed, and I'm panning as the animals are running past me. So I'm using it about 1/10 of a second and trying to pan at the exact same speed as the animal. So the animal ends up being sharp and all the background ends up being blurred. That creates a very dynamic sense of speed, which is what I was feeling as I'm just watching these animals race by, race by, race by. How do I convey that sense of blurred time with good execution of your camera settings and a connection to the subject matter? That's the creative intent that came out of that, and it really reflects what I was seeing, sensing, and feeling in the moment. Two other examples from Italy. The two background photos of the mountains, the brighter ones, those are daytime scouting shots. So I'm just walking around scouting. I'm not looking at getting a great photo. That's not what it's about. It's about connecting. It's about really feeling what this place has to offer and to actually receive that. And the darker photos of the streaky clouds, those were the final compositions. But super important to just take the time, be still, don't be racing around like a mad person going after everything. Give yourself enough time and space to be in a very spacious connection with nature as you go through these kinds of practices. So for me, they unfold in this sequence from 1 to 5. And that's the way I teach them in my photo workshops. So that's pretty much the end of the presentation. But I want to also offer a couple of ways that you guys can, opportunities to learn these principles of how to actually bring this into your own creative process and how to use very practical, simple field practices that can help you access the creative flow state, the visionary gap, spaciousness, emptiness, whatever works for you. And there's one opportunity this fall. I've only got 3 spots left for a 3-day fall colors workshop out of the San Juans in Ridgway, Colorado. And that's going to be from October 1st to the 3rd. If you want to just sign up for that as a single participant, it's $5.95. If you want to sign up with a friend and 2 of you sign up, you can save a lot and do it for $10.50 for both of you. I think that works out to $5.25 each. So there's one opportunity. And I also offer creativity coaching. So, and for a limited time, for the next 5 days, I'm going to offer 15% off all my coaching sessions. I have 2 session packages. One I call Creative Expedition, which is 6 75-minute sessions, normally $900. It's going to be $765. And that starts with a consultation, 20-minute consultation, just to figure if this is going to be a good fit for where you are with your photography. Helps me understand what your intent is, whether you need more work on the technical, camera settings work, or maybe that's not a problem for you and you want to really focus on the creative expression and how to access more of these creative states. In the consultation call, we'll figure that out so that we can really target the work to exactly what you want and need to take your photography to the next level. And then the Summit series is a more comprehensive approach to that, which is 12 75-minute sessions, normally 1,650 for 1,400. So it's 15% off both of those. And if any of these are interesting to you and you want to talk about it, feel free to contact me. We can organize or schedule a free consultation and talk about different options and see what might work best for you. You can also just do a single session as just sort of a taster, see what this would look and feel like and if it would benefit your photography. So that's it for the presentation. And I'm going to see if I can go to chat now and see if we can take some calls or some questions. And you could also, if you don't want to type your question into chat, you could also unmute yourself and ask a question. So let me get to chat, see if there's any questions. One is, this will be recorded. Yes, it will be recorded for sure. And I'll make that available on my YouTube channel tomorrow. Any questions or comments or clarification about what was covered this evening? Did you guys find this useful or interesting? Okay, not getting a lot of feedback here. Matt, do you have anything you would like to add?
I mean, the biggest thing too is even just on a day-to-day thing is to get out and shoot, even if it's in the backyard, trying to capture like even walking down the street or whatever. Just always like thinking in terms of photography and having the camera available, and it kind of gets you set up to kind of take care of that you're familiar with your camera all the time, so that when you're in the field, you don't have to really, you know, think about it. It all becomes just automatic.
Exactly, yes. If you have a primary camera that you use, I think it's a great suggestion to just, even if you just play with it in the house, just if you're still sort of working with the camera settings part of it, have that camera in contact with your hand as much as possible and just start to get familiar with where the settings are so that it does become automatic, so that that part of your brain isn't front and center when you're in the field, that it becomes automatic and can sort of drop into the background, and then the creative process and how to connect with nature becomes much more front and center. So there's a few comments and questions I'd like to address here. One person asked, Stefan, where do I get my inspiration? Yeah, that's a good question. What I would say is several things. Where I get a lot of my inspiration is through nature, just being in nature, just immersing myself in nature and being quiet in nature. Even if I'm photographing with friends, I go off every day and just by myself and be quiet. Just stop talking is a huge practice. It creates a massive state shift when I can just be in nature, initially with my own thoughts, because my thoughts are pretty active. But then when I start to quiet and stop and be still, my thoughts really slow and become very quiet. And that's a huge source of inspiration for me, is just the moment. Other sources of inspiration. There are some photographers that I really enjoy their work and get a lot of creative inspiration from, but that's minimal, because what I really have appreciated over the years is going to locations I haven't seen photography from. It sort of clears my mind. If I'm, early on, I did a lot of iconic photography, going to iconic locations and looking at all the best images of the Grand Canyons and the Sierra Nevadas and seeing what every other photographer did. And I would go there and my head would be so full of other people's images, I couldn't really be present to my own unique creative expression. So I intentionally minimize how much photography I look at. There's a handful of photographers, maybe 3 or 4, that I look at their imagery. Paul Nicklin is one, amazing photographer, fellow Canadian. I think he's one of the most gifted photographers in the world. He doesn't shoot like I do, so it's he's very inspirational, but I'm not going to copy his style because I'm not doing underwater photography and things like that. But it gives me deep inspiration. So those are things I would say, and also a daily meditation practice is a huge source of inspiration and insight and into the visionary realm that really helps my photography and my whole creative process. Okay, let me see if there's anything else. Um, yeah, so a question, since you imagine your images, do you try to use do you try to use or be creative using Photoshop, or do you focus on out of the camera with little Photoshop work? So I think what the question is, am I trying to, am I using a lot of photo editing to sort of enhance the creativity of how the image looks, or am I trying to use mostly of what I get out of the camera? And I would say mostly the latter, but what I'm very fascinated about and what I'm getting into is combining multimedia, um, using programs like Painter, Corel Painter, with my photos. I haven't posted anything like this yet, but I find it fascinating being able to use painting programs to give more of the energetic quality of what I was sensing in the moment. My photos that you see, like on my Instagram post or my website, I try to get the capture in the camera as the best I can so that I don't have to do a lot of creative processing. That's why I use a lot of ND filters. I use a lot of um, focus stacking so that I'm getting the capture in the field as close to what I feel, sense, and see in the moment. And then it's going to take minimal processing. I process every photo, and I think I have pretty sophisticated processing skills, but I'm not doing, occasionally I'll do a composite, and I'll say that with the photo. Like there's some Vancouver Island beach scenes that are composites, meaning my camera's not moving, but I'll take 2 or 3 photos of waves moving at different times and then combine them. But I state that. I try to be as sort of authentic to the creative process as I can. A lot of my images are just single images. I'd say 95% of my images are just single images. Sometimes I do focus stacks, composites, but I want to be very clear and upfront with what I'm doing. But I like to get really precise execution in the field and get it right in the camera. If I can do that with one image, that's what I prefer. So yeah, great question. Okay, good. Getting some comments that this has been useful. Great. yeah, and we're coming up to one of the best seasons of the year, fall, and so many opportunities to get out in the field and practice this. And these are some of the comments that I'm reading is that, yeah, get out and get into low stakes light. You don't want to go out and learn your camera in high stakes situation where the light is super fleeting and you've got a 10-minute window to capture a big panorama, streaky cloud blurs. If you don't know your camera, you're not going to do it. It's not going to happen. So spend time in low stakes situations. Get out, scout, connect, be still, go for a walk in nature without your camera or without the intent to shoot, and just start to establish connection and this sensitivity to receiving from nature rather than taking from nature. I think that's a really profound shift, and it profoundly shifts how our mind thinks and how we feel about the moment. Okay, any other questions or comments before I wrap this up? You can feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like. Okay, well, I think I'm going to wrap this up then. I'll stop the recording and I'll post that on my YouTube channel tomorrow. And I'll be able to get everyone's address that registered for the webinar, so you'll be able to listen to that tomorrow. So thank you everyone for joining me, and hope to see some of you on the workshop. Enjoy your fall and have a great time in nature photographing. Take care. Be well.